Harish is there.
Yeah.
Professor Parikar, you may start now.
Very good afternoon. Welcome to all. It's indeed a great pleasure to introduce and welcome today's distinguished speaker and my longtime friend, Professor Udaya Kumar from Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi. He is in fact giving us his valuable time in the midst of his last minute preparations to go abroad day after tomorrow. Udaya Kumar is professor at Centre for English Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. His publications include Writing the First Person, Literature, History, and Autobiography in Modern Kerala, published by Permanent Black 2016, and The Joycian Labyrinth, Repetition, Time, and Tradition in Ulysses, published from Oxford Clarendon Press 1991. And he has written papers on modern literature and culture, especially on Kerala. His recent research has focused on death and contemporary culture, forms of life writing, cultural histories of the body, and idioms of vernacular social thought. He has been widely traveled and widely published. Recently, he has been awarded the prestigious fellowship to visit Nantes Institute of Advanced Study in France. Literature and the pleasure of the text. While theorizing, he would not forget any time. He would cherish literature and the pleasure of the text while theorizing. Local histories, social transformations, formation of new political identities, caste and gender issues, and fashioning of new literary practices always excited Professor Udaya Kumar and informed his writings. I warmly welcome Uday and request him to deliver his lecture on literary cultures, reading practices, and some problems of translation. Thank you. Welcome all. Over to Uday.
Thank you. Thank you, Shivaram. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Shivaram. And thank you both Shivaram and Rindan for inviting me. I must say I'm a little awed and intimidated by this audience. And I also see many friends here. I can see Harish's face and many others. So hello to everybody. So I must begin by saying that I'm not a translation studies person. I haven't really done much work studying translation, unlike many of you. And I have some experience of translation, some poetry from Malayalam to English. But more importantly, translation has been an integral part of my academic work, like the academic work of many of the people who are assembled here. Quite a bit of my writing is on Malayalam literature, and a fair bit of that is written in English. So that has of necessity involved translating from Malayalam texts into a context of English discussion, sometimes rendering them into the English language. But recently I had some occasions to think that this is not really limited to my writing in English alone. When I write in Malayalam academic papers on Malayalam writing, again, I find that there is a kind of translation process which is at work there, both from English as well as from Malayalam itself into Malayalam. So part of what I'm going to say comes from this experience of doing translation, but not as a professional translator, doing translation to make it available to a readership as a standalone work through which they access something written in another language, but doing translation as an accompaniment or inevitable part of academic discussion, academic analysis, both in the same language as well as in another language. Some of these issues I confronted more clearly a few months ago when I had an opportunity to discuss the poetry of a very important figure from 19th century Kerala, Sri Narayana Guru. Now, Sri Narayana Guru is, uh, it's difficult to kind of classify him as a poet. He is also a spiritual thinker. He's a philosopher. He was at the center of the lower caste reform movements in Kerala. And he is seen as one of these iconic figures of what in Kerala are called the great figures of modernity. Now, I was invited to a discussion on Sri Narayana Guru's poetic universe. And while I was beginning to discuss his poetry, the first thing that struck me was that there is some basic difference or some distance between the kind of poetic universe through which people like me entered the literary world in Malayalam as readers of poetry and sometimes as amateur writers of poetry, and the world in which Sri Narayanan's poems took shape. This is partly a question of what I have tried to call literary cultures. For one thing, writing in verse was far more common at that time. And this was not confined to literary compositions. There are newspapers which were run entirely in the verse form in Kerala. And I suppose this would be true in many other parts of India as well. That is the use of verse, not only for literary composition, but the use of verse is part of a kind of apprenticeship in culture, apprenticeship in language, and of mastering different traditions, etc., etc. So some of the things which I'm going to say comes from this background. So there are some references to Malayalam here, which may be unfamiliar to many people in the audience, for which I apologize. But I hope that some of the issues which come up in this paper and some of the suggestions which I make, which are very tentative, would be of interest to the audience. So I'll begin reading this paper. While working on the thought of Sri Narayana Guru, who lived between 1856 and 1928, he was a renowned spiritual and social thinker from Kerala. I faced some difficulties in translating passages from some of his writings to English. I was translating these for citation and analysis and not for standalone publication. English renderings of these passages became especially challenging when analysis tried to follow the movement of thought by focusing on particular words or concepts and on the connections that the text seemed to forge among them. The problem was not really about equivalences between words in English and those in the Malayalam, although equivalence and approximation are particularly unstable when we deal with conceptual vocabulary. Translation seems to work precisely in that uncertain territory of promise and of the risk of similitudes without any guarantee. This experience is all the more pronounced where the languages involved have no clear linkages through evolution or adjacency in contemporary life. The histories, the neighborhoods, and the resonances of individual words differ, and the loss and the unjustified gain involved in the decisions of the translator resist being computed in advance. But here, I am concerned less with this lexical dimension of translation than with the question of connectedness, the flow, and the force of textual sequences. The issue confronted me forcefully when I worked with Srinarayanan's rare prose writings, where he adopts a diction that is different in its rhythms from familiar idioms of prose and verse writing in Malayalam. For instance, in the opening of a text titled Atma Vilasam, which may loosely be translated as the play of the self or the multiple manifestations of the self, we find a register that oscillates between the mystical and the philosophical. After much effort, uh, I produced an English rendering of the opening paragraph like this. I'm not reading the original Malayalam uh, because many of you did not follow the language. The English which I eventually produced, which I remain unsatisfied with, goes like this. Om. All this seems to be like a shadow that appears in a mirror placed before us. How amazing. The eye that sees everything, it's not seen by the eye. When we hold a mirror before the eye appears as a shadow in the mirror. When the eye sees the mirror as well, then the eye sees the mirror as well as the shadow. The shadow is less. It does not have the power to see the eye. The eye does not have the power to look directly at itself. Thus, when the eye and its shadow are not visible in our eye, it is we who see the eye there. Similarly, we do not see the we who sees the eye. I aim to show that the articulation of the sense of the self in these lines worked through a demonstration that focused on exteriority, that involved a mirror, the shadow, the gaze, and the elusive figure of the viewing subject. The English rendering, with quite some difficulty, managed to indicate the scenography of the self in this passage to the reader, but it failed to convey the energetic charge of the original, its tempo, and its rhythm. Even more elusive was the gestural quality of the locutions, which approximated bodily expressions of surprise and delight in what is seen and revealed. The passage at times has an intensive sense of certainty and surprise, indicated by the suffix tanne in the first sentence, niril pola tanne, which means exactly like a shadow. The single word explanation adpudam that follows works as an echo of this expression of certainty. Alliteration, kannine, kanna, kanannilla, kannadi, arising from the repetition of the word for eye, that is kanna, and the word for the mirror, which is kannadi, and several forms of the verb kanaga, or to see, seem to produce an effect of acoustic confusion, which arguably parallels the perceptual bewilderment at the core of the experience invoked in the passage. Am I going too fast? Is it clear what I'm saying?
It's clear, no
Okay,
problem.
thank you. I have presented this as a problem of the difference between languages, but this may be somewhat limiting as an approach. Can we really speak of the differences between languages as if languages possess stable, self-contained identities? We know that Naoki Sakai persuasively argued that it's not because two different language unities are given that we have to translate or interpret one text into another. It is because translation articulates languages so that we may postulate the two unities of the translating and the translated languages as if they were autonomous and closed entities through a certain representation of translation. The thrust of Sakai's argument is to challenge the model of homolingual address, which seems to underpin stable notions of language identity associated prominently with cultural nationalism. Sakai argues that the translational process predicated on heterolingual address creates a certain protocol which produces as its effect the idea of separate languages with distinctive identities. Viewed in this way, arguments about proximity and distance, neighborhoods and territories may appear less dependable in their presupposition of clearly demarcated spaces. We seem to be in a domain of expanding neighborhoods rather than in that of territories with sharply policed regulations of entry and exit. In other words, even within what we consider as the unity of the language, we are in a state of heterolingual address, and processes of translation are underway in acts of reading and interpretation. Our linguistic inhabitation is not in a self-enclosed territorial space, but in what may be called a plane of continuous variation. This approach enables us to examine the nature of the difficulties that are indicated in the opening paragraph more closely. The sonic and gestural feel of the passage from Srinarayanan's Atmavilasam actively mobilizes many such variations. It is not even clear if this text has a purported addressee. The tone is that of registering and documenting an experience of discovery by articulating it, saying it, or writing it. However, the utterance and the act of articulation are part of the experience of discovery and realization and not really outside them. Metaphysical propositions appear here not as presented in a neutral space, but simultaneously as the experience and recording of a vision where it is difficult to determine who the viewer and the objects of vision are. The problem I face while translating this passage is not unique to English. Were one to write on this text in the register of modern academic writing in Malayalam, problems of a similar nature are likely to arise. Part of the problem comes from the difficulty in grasping and engaging the force of alliteration and the gestural and sonic inflections as part of philosophical writing. One is not sure as to how to determine its value and its effects for an academic reading. The distinction between English and Malayalam as stable linguistic entities with their distinctive features and expressive possibilities will not be sufficient to help us understand this. The internal dynamic of Malayalam, both in Srinarayanan's times and as it operates in our present, appears to play a role in configuring the terms of our reading. This is not, again, a matter of Malayalam alone. We will find similar issues in most, if not all, Indian languages. It may not even be a matter of Indian languages versus English. Some of the discourses in the English language in India to deviate from the protocols of the academic register and may show energies similar to the one we mentioned above. This may have much to do with the complex effects of the colonial encounter on the concepts, practices, and normative structures of language. The concept of the vernacular, I put the word vernacular in inverted commas because it's an object of investigation here rather than an object of reference, which is clearly established. The concept of the vernacular has been used sometimes to thematize the deployment of force that characterizes the uses of language I mentioned above. Rather than employing this concept to designate individual languages that do not have cosmopolitan scope, one may use it to refer to domains of exchange and inhabitation within a language that are at variance with the protocols of official and formal discourses. Partha Chatterjee once advanced a case for such a use of the term vernacular soon after the publication of the collection History in the Vernacular, pointing to a domain of the production of knowledge that remains outside the ambit of disciplinary discourses in professional academic structures and spaces. While elaborating on this distinction, Chatterjee pointed out how many key themes in Indian social sciences research, for instance, caste in the case of modern Indian sociology, first emerged as issues with political charge in the vernacular domain before they entered academic disciplinary discourses. He even proposed that issues identified as political in the vernacular domain of knowledge often turn into methodological problems after they enter the disciplinary domain. We often see academic and vernacular discourses trade charges against each other for being political. For both parties, the allegation of being political signifies the operation of vested interests, although its sense may not be identical. For academic discourse, the political character of the vernacular usually signifies an absence of methodological rigor and a deviation from the protocols of academic objectivity and veridiction, while for the latter, the entire edifice of the academy appears at times as a self-concealing repository of institutional vested interests that obstruct an egalitarian passage to justice. The distinction between the vernacular and the professional academic was primarily elaborated in the context of knowledge production in a post-colonial context. But the distinction can be of some use for understanding the arrangement and transactions between discourses in a wider sense. We may be able to approach the problem I began this essay with in the light of this discussion. How would we characterize a text like Atmavilasam? It does possess a close relationship with knowledge and to doctrines developed and debated in philosophy. Signs of training in philosophical thinking are evident in the text. However, overriding the tone of the erudite philosophical thinker is a feel of animation and energy. The latter refers to immediate experience, articulated in the language of ordinary life and not subjected to processes of linguistic refinement that usually characterize the discourse of abstract thought. More importantly, the relationship between the speaking voice and the text of the utterance seems to be different from what we usually find in conceptual philosophical arguments. The speaking voice in Atmavilasam conveys not only insights and truths arrived at, but also the delight and the excitement of the experience of this arrival. Several locutions in the text, as I mentioned, have a gestural quality which comes from an oscillation between immersion in various activities in the world and watching these from a distance as if on a screen. The image of the mirror in the passage I cited inaugurates this configuration of action and observation. One might say that this oscillation shapes the implication of the speaking voice in the text. It is difficult to characterize this voice as belonging to an individual subject in the usual sense. The word that refers to the first person is nam in Malayalam, which is the first person plural, the equivalent of we, but it can be used for referring to oneself in the singular too, as in the use of honorific plurals used by, for instance, the royalty, etc., etc. This usage suggests a tone of impersonality, which moves away from the claim of unique interiority that the first person references invoke in modern contexts. Interestingly, the speaking voice in academic discourse, be this philosophy or other disciplines, also resists being understood as belonging to individual subjects. First person singular in modern academic discourse have a peculiar status in that, in relation to the arguments proposed, they refer not to a biographical subject, but usually to an order of impersonal demonstration. Even when personal or biographical references or anecdotes from one's own life are invoked, they are often subject to a sort of ironic amelioration, in that they serve as pretext for entry into a domain of analytic or speculative thought, where we leave behind the world of references to identifiable individuals in their specificity. I wondered if some of the difficulty I had in translating texts such as Atmavilasam had to do with this transiting between these two orders of impersonality, especially since my attempt involved embedding or incorporating Srinarayanan's sentences into an academic analysis and commentary. The translations I did for citation led to arguments that framed the passage in terms of commentary and analysis. Among other things, there was the problem of tone. While the impersonality of academic discourse presumed what is seen as reasoned argumentation and reflection, the text in the vernacular appeared to work a different, more robust tenor. The prose had something almost physical and informal, while at the same time staying a little elevated from the level of the ordinary and the everyday by the sheer charge of an intensity that propelled it. These features are precisely the ones that I found difficult to carry over into English that I made from the text for academic discussion. In describing this at some length, I am not making a case for the impossibility of translation or for the loss inherent in the passage to another language. My interest is rather in the narrower question of the permeability and the resistance of the text in the vernacular to academic contexts and reading practices. Such permeability may indeed be a feature of all texts, but my concern here is with some issues that arise when one transits between different registers of thought and expression, which cannot be fully understood through a framework of discrete language identities conceived on a model of well-policed territorial units. This is more of a division or a variation within language itself. The vernacular and the professional academic are only two instances or modes of existence of this spectrum of variation. We need to be careful not to replicate the model of territorial differentiation and see these as stable subdomains within a language. In other words, communication within a language involves translation between unstable variations of meaning and energy. These are not transactions between two independent and completed entities, as much as connections established within that oscillates within the oscillations of a fluctuating medium between low and high intensities of force. The distinction between object language and meta language, which rethinks, which thinks in terms of vertical levels, because we know that the object language, meta language model works with a kind of verticality, is perhaps better seen as an effect of the translational process, which tries to regulate and order variation by splitting and freezing it into planes arranged hierarchically. I began with Srinarayanan for other reasons as well. His composition spanned three languages: Malayalam, Tamil, and Sanskrit. After learning Tamil in his childhood, he acquired deep proficiency in Sanskrit under the tutelage of Kummambally Ramanpillai Ashan, whose writings include not only commentaries on Sanskrit texts, but also those in Tamil. This trilingualism in the context of 19th century Kerala, especially in Travancore, where Tamil also had a specially privileged status in the royal court and in the bureaucracy in the capital, is closer to the situation of variation rather than to one of coexistence of discrete languages. This is evident in the history of literary production in Malayalam in what we refer to as the medieval period. Whether it be in the Manipravalam tradition, in which Sanskrit words share poetic space with elements from what is called Pasha, or the Patta tradition where the presence of Tamil words and word endings predominate. It is difficult to demarcate the locus of Malayalam or what was referred to as Pasha territorially. It is rather to be understood through subtractions and eliminations. Leela Tilakam, a text on Manipravalam from the 14th century, rediscovered in the early 20th, seems to have regarded the space of Pasha as what is left in Manipravalam after the subtraction of Sanskrit words. However, this formulation is also referring to a variant, as it is also characterized as the language of the three upper Varna groups, or the Trivarnikas, in distinction from the people of low birth or the Hina Jati. Rich Freeman pointed out that the variant associated with the Hina Jati, as described in Leela Tilakam, displays features from the use of Pasha in the East Coast, thus indicating an overlap between various idioms of differentiation, resulting in an intermeshing of regional self-awareness and linguistic practices anchored in cultures associated with Varna and Jati. This is not specific to medieval times when the linguistic identity of Malayalam was not established with clarity. Its traces can be found, as I have tried to show, in Srinarayanan's prose writings from the late 19th and the 20th centuries. The spectrum of variation that gives the light to pictures of stable language identities visible in contemporary writing too, notably literature produced by speech communities that stand at a distance from what is generally regarded as the dominant standard in literary usage. Dalit writers from various parts of India have mobilized the energies of this variation powerfully. The emergence of Dalit literature as a pan-Indian category in publishing and in literary analysis, especially in English, we know has had some relationship to the circulation of English translations of these texts and to the currency acquired by this category in the media and the academy. Insofar as certain features of language use and specific strategies of writing are marked as characteristic of contemporary Dalit writing, the formation of this category in academic discourse may need to be seen as dependent upon the disciplining of the energetic use of variation, which initially contributed to its significance and impact. Dalit writing is not the only site where these processes are evident. Concepts of academic discourse, whose definition is anchored in variations from the dominant standard, understood as based on the distinctiveness of language used by social groups of regions, tend to evidence intimate tensions between variation and disciplining. In the remaining part of this talk, I hope to tease out two questions that emerge from this. One, how does a recognition of variation, rather than solid linguistic identities, as our point of departure, affect our conception of translation? And two, how can we describe the operations that academic criticism performs on vernacular literary production if we approach it through the dynamic of translation sketched above? In order to respond to these questions, a closer engagement with literary cultures and reading practices becomes necessary. I shall therefore begin with that. In a very important essay titled Nationalism and the Imagination, Gayatri Spivak made an important set of arguments about subaltern literary cultures in contemporary times. She stresses the oral formulaic, in inverted commas, as an important element of literary production among the tribal communities she worked with in rural West Bengal. In Spivak's use, this term refers to an iterative production of utterances that serves as the locus of inventive improvisation, thus permitting the incorporation of elements of various kinds and origins without being constrained by the demands of epistemic coherence. I quote from Spivak, "The oral formulaic can appropriate material of all sorts into its machine, robbing the content of its epistemic charge if it does not fit the inventiveness of the occasion. The rhythmic iterative impulse that works with a principle of equivalence appears here as a mode of imaginative production that has survived over time and is perhaps on the verge of forgetting and disappearance. What modes of oral imaginative production were at work in the compositions of a poet like Srinarayanan, who worked in a milieu of linguistic variation, the amplitude of which spanned over at least 3 languages in the modern calculus of enumeration? I'm not suggesting that the energies of the vernacular ought to be understood in terms of the oral as opposed to the literal. The relationship between the oral and the written is often complex. Aniket Javre, for instance, has contested the claims made about the oral in the Brahminical Sanskrit tradition by arguing that the oral, which is aimed at invariant repetition, ought to be seen as a form of indelible inscription. I quote from Aniket Javre: "After mastering the text in a variety of combinations of letters, forward, backward, skipping or exchanging every second or third letter, and so on, the text is as stable in memory as any text written down and preserved in that material form. It is as good as a written text, and the distinction and supposed difference between the written and the oral collapses. In fact, it is further possible to argue that the material on which the text is preserved in writing is more capable of corruption than this solemn, sacred, and dutiful memory. It is more written than text written on material surfaces." Now, we are familiar with this, like the learning of the Vedas, for instance, in Brahmin communities. E.M.S. Namboodiripad, the famous communist leader and a thinker from Kerala, in his autobiography speaks about his learning the Rigveda. And there are competitions where you recite verses of the Veda backwards and forward. And these are mnemonic techniques which are meant to be mastered. But one thing which was not taught in that apprenticeship was the meaning of the verses. Yeah? So this is interesting. The work of invention that we found in the oral formulaic is absent here. It is even forbidden and guarded against. Interestingly, the distinction between these two modes also seem to possess a gender-related dimension. Javre associated the Brahminical oral transmission of an identical text with what he calls the principle of inheritance, which can, as with property, so with memory, easily be equated to that of male lineage. In the subaltern tribal context, Spivak linked the oral formulaic with Sabar women, while men, in quotes, inhabit an enforced illiteracy rather than an orality at home with itself and with the great genealogical memories. I invoked these two nuanced accounts to foreground contrasting pictures of what is usually described as oral. They might serve as an important background for considering the interplay of the textual and the oral in a figure like Srinarayanan. It is said that many of Srinarayanan's verse compositions initially existed orally and only later were set in writing. Some others were composed without the aid of writing and then dictated orally to disciples for transcription. Like the prose text Atma Vilasam, which I mentioned, is something which was discovered in the notebooks of one of his disciples called Shivalinga Swami. These practices were quite common in Kerala and elsewhere in India too, especially at that time. Even now, they may not have disappeared altogether. One might say that these poems of Srinarayanan were initially composed in his mind, but we must distinguish this idea of the mind from the modern conception of the mind as the locus of the poet's individual interiority, as a sort of otherness that can be contrasted with bodily and public existence. Furthermore, the space of composition here is not anterior to its emergence in sound. Metrical regularity, rhythm, and the sound structure of verses take shape in a mental space that is indistinguishable from the public domain of the voice. One has to move beyond any direct opposition between the oral and the written to grasp the dynamic of their interrelationship in such instances. In the spectrum that extends from the reproduction of the identical in the kind of oral tradition invoked by Aniket to the inventive employment of equivalence in the subaltern tribal tradition in Spivak's account, orality had a range of relations with textuality and remembrance. Srinarayanan's mastery over the Sanskrit and Tamil textual traditions was marked by the audacious inflection of the robust vernacular. One might say that the vernacular element in Srinarayanan's innovative iteration came less from the tradition of Malayalam writing as from the domain of life practices, including those of local and regional traditions of spiritual practice. The famous statement attributed to him when challenged about his ritual qualification for the consecration of Arivipuram Shiva temple, that it was an Irava Shiva or a lower caste Shiva that he installed, and that Brahmins need not worry, illustrate this well. The statement works not through argumentation, but through a gestural move towards deflation of the claim that serves as the ground of the challenge. A similar gestural quality, arguably corporeal rather than textual in its expressive orientation, is evident in anecdotal accounts of Srinarayanan's conversations. His verse writings span a wide range, from devotional compositions of ardent passion to abstruse metaphysical propositions and arguments. And prose writings, smaller in number, evince to varying degrees a state of heightened intensity of energetic articulation which transgresses the formal restraints of literary prose. His metaphysical verses, such as Swanubhava Giti or Ariva, show an intricate play of pronouns and numbers which make the listener or writer work with intense concentration. Simple, ubiquitously used demonstrative pronouns like either and other, that is this and that, and numerals such as 5, 5, 6, 6, 8, 8 are repeated in tightly composed verses where their referents need to be identified through a careful unraveling of the verse and a parsing of its syntax. This process is not a matter of the eye. It is only by enunciating the verse, sensing the syntactic connections between the words, which may not always follow the sequence in which they appear in the line, that the reader comes to grasp the meaning. And the pleasure of this intricate arrangement arises from a smooth and continuous re-enunciation of the verse in its entirety after figuring out these connections. Does this work belong to the order of the oral or the literal? Parsing makes it necessary for us to hold these lines in the mind, going back and forth over them, and this makes it akin to what Javare describes as an orality that is akin to writing. However, the pleasure of the verses comes from a sensitivity to variations and the surprises it experiences. Here, repetition works not at the reproduction of the identical, but drawing on the resources of equivalence that we encountered earlier while discussing the oral formulaic. The pleasure of these surprises is similar to that of verbal puzzles. In unraveling the verse, the listener's mind works not in the mental, but in the auditory and corporeal engagement with words and sounds. These compositions presuppose a culture of reading where embodied practices of listening, retention, and performative improvisation are central. In the vernacular literary culture of 19th century Kerala, proficiency in verse idioms was more preponderant than in prose. My friend Ashokan Nambia, in his doctoral dissertation, has researched it in great detail. Verse was not reserved for literary and devotional compositions, but also for obituaries, scientific information, and even news items. C. Kunirama Menon, the editor of Kerala Patrika, an early 20th century newspaper from Travancore, Ashokan Nambiar says, remembered the difficulty of finding news reporters who could send their reports in prose, as many of them preferred to file them in verse. The verse form, with its relationship to rhythm and memory, perhaps points to a set of more proximate relations between the bodily existence and the literary. The gestural quality of the prose of Atmavilasam, which we discussed at the beginning of the paper, is a sign of this relationship. The problem I began with was that of translation. What is it to translate instances of literary production from one culture of reading and writing to another? In this question, as I pointed out earlier, two distinct problems overlap. Firstly, there is a question of what we usually understand as languages, that is linguistic identities, Malayalam and the English. Secondly, there is the problem of variation between the vernacular and the academic registers. I was translating in order to cite and to analyze. One could say that the translated text was meant for purposes that were totally different from those for which the original was intended. More importantly, the practices that the reader or listener engaged in these two cases were substantially different. In discussing Atmavilasam, my aim was to understand this text within a history of idioms of writing about the self in modern Malayalam. Although I began my project as an exploration of the emergence and evolution of the genre of autobiographical writing in Malayalam, I quickly realized that autobiography may not be the only or even the most important place to look for the key moments of such a history. Idioms of self-articulation emerge not only in forms that are explicitly identified as self-narratives, they are forged with resources from a variety of forms of writing in 19th century Kerala, which do not often tally with the distinct literary genres with which academic literary studies works now. Atmavilasam was an example of this. It is difficult to determine if it is prose or poetry, mystical or metaphysical writing. This difficulty is not merely one of analytical and interpretative protocols appropriate for the text. It is also about the practices within which the text circulates and lives its lives. What are these practices? Are they those of a literary reading leading to an aesthetic effect, which may in turn be excavated through an academic investigation, which seeks to lay bare the textual mechanisms and strategies behind it? Or are they practices that seek to realize a spiritual experience of dissolution of the self? If this is so, are we to see textual mechanisms as leading to this experience in the same way as in literary reading and aesthetic effects? I am not concerned so much about the distinction between what I have called spiritual and literary experiences as with the differences between the practices involved. Texts such as Atmavilasam appear to presuppose a certain disposition that is, strictly speaking, not that of erudition, although the text might be informed by a deep knowledge of Advaita thought and other traditions of spiritual thinking in southern India. The address of the text to its reader or listener is belied by a sense of the absence of an addressee for the statements that appear within the text. The latter seem to be in the nature of documentation or a narration addressed to none other than oneself, although the scope of the idea of oneself remains unspecified and potentially expansive. The reader or listener, uninvited to this internal world, partakes of it by attending to it and thus learning from an experience of witnessing. A practice of spiritual pedagogy which does not involve direct access from the guru to the shishya seems to be at work here. We may perhaps be able to understand the problem of genres better if we take it away from the specific literary context in which it is usually considered in academic literary studies and consider them anew in terms of the practices in which texts are embedded. The specific force of the vernacular, in the sense in which I described it earlier, may be more clearly sensed if we see it as working the relationship of address witnessing, and pedagogy we encountered above. Rather than engaged in an analytical deciphering of sentences in the text and their interpretative appropriation, the addressee assumes a posture of absorbed witnessing. The vernacular gestural quality of the prose confers on this relationship a dimension of energy and intimacy. These tonal or textual attributes are not external or supplementary to the content. They are at the core of the work that the text performs and the practice in which it is located. The translation of texts like this for citation and analysis in academic discourse thus conceals a second order of translation from the practice embedded non-interpretative protocols of a vernacular text to the analytical unpacking of textual machinery in an academic context. It is important not to see these as two self-enclosed domains and translation as a bridge of traffic effected between them. Rather, these two modes of textual existence ought to be seen as instances in a field of variations, and the possibility of transit between one to the other is at the heart of our life in language. The vernacular and the academic are thus unstable economies open to one another. This enables us to understand better one of the challenges that English literary studies in India is faced with today. Have an awareness of modalities of textual existence and reading cultures can be incorporated into its core conception. This problem came to the foreground with special force in the 90s, when literary texts from Indian languages were introduced into English literature syllabi in many universities in India and became objects of doctoral research in many universities abroad. The frequent acknowledgement of the limits and difficulties involved in this has usually focused on the differences between Indian languages and English. One insufficiently examined consequence of this approach is the stability it confers on both these languages and the reduction of the transactions between them into the plane of textual and narrative structures. This often has the effect of reproducing a nationalist idea of language, leading to a negotiation of the terms of exchange between languages on the basis of this model. This pushes us sometimes into a strange paradox, the decolonizing and post-colonial thrust in English studies, resulting in a nationalist consolidation of modern Indian literatures. Arguments for pluralizing this model by the inclusion of diverse identities and communities and traditions do not perhaps go far enough, as they do not necessarily challenge the model of language identity and literary textuality that frames the institutional space. I have tried to argue against this approach. The discussion above points to the centrality of variation and to the suggestion that translation is intrinsic to linguistic practice. The challenge posed by the Indian language literary text in the English classroom may then be seen as one of recognizing the dependence of literary studies on translation, not only in the sense of an interlinguistic transaction, but also between variations, between practices within what is identified as one language. The challenge faced by English in its encounter with these texts is mirrored to an extent by modern academic criticism within Indian languages. This can be faced only by attending to the diverse nature of literary cultures and to the practices in which texts are produced and embedded. The questions that emerge from this turn are fundamental. What do we mean by literature in the Indian literary studies classroom? What modes of translational activity is this concept dependent upon? What histories have determined its regulation and the emergence of the discourse of academic literary studies? Finally, this move may enable a re-estimation of the value and power of criticism and point to a shift away from unveiling the hidden through the interpretation of textual strategies to attending to the practices in which texts serve as props, objects that are indispensable to the performance of acts, but that do not hold the key to secret meanings. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Udaya Kumar, for your brilliant speech. We have received a few questions on the chat box. The first one is from.
Okay, can I just take a piece of paper? One second, please. I'll
Yeah.
just get a piece of paper. Yes, please. Thank you.
Yeah, Professor Hita Rathore is asking you, India is a land of various regional languages. How do we tackle the problem of cultural connotations getting lost in connection to the entire process of translation? Can we really translate meaning in its truest sense?
Right. Can we take 2 or 3 questions at one go, Rindan, and then
Yeah.
I respond to
Okay.
them? So then there can be a
The
greater
next one
connection.
is from Chinmay Dharukar. Uh, he has a he has a comment actually. Literary genres are also a matter of larger aesthetic experience in a literary culture. Unless we have an exhaustive ontology of genres and experience, I doubt if academic literary circles can come to grips with the instance like Atma Vilasam. Your comment.
Right. Let's take one more if there is, and
Okay.
then
There is another one. Maya Vinay. She has written. This is a concerning Sri Narayana Guru's Daiva Daksham. Why is the Supreme addressed as Ni in this Kriti? For example, Nyallo Shrishtyam.
mm, right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, for these questions. See, uh, these are really the kind of problems I was trying to flag. And to come to the first question, the cultural connotations, the large number of regional languages, and how does translation, how much can translation communicate the cultural connotation? Now, the point I was trying to get at was that uh, even posing the problem in those terms uh, probably reduces its complexity in the sense that we tend to think that within what we identify as a language, there is actually coherence about these cultural connotations. And what I have tried to suggest is that that language identity or the space of a language needs to be seen as a space of variation. So even within the use of a language, we are constantly caught up in this practice of negotiating variation, and that is the essence of translation. So the problem between the regional languages is actually an extension of the problem within the regional languages. And sometimes we tend to forget that. But having said this, as I indicated, I'm not suggesting that, therefore, translation is an impossibility. On the contrary, what I'm suggesting is that translation is at the core of the practice of language itself. So in that sense, it's not something which is superadded to it. It is not something which is like an extra burden, but it is actually at the heart of our lives in languages. So cultural connotations are always negotiated, captured through this encounter with variation, rather than captured in some kind of purity or in pure adulteration. Now, the second question, you're absolutely right. The problem is actually what I would add to what you said is that uh, it's not the ontology of genres is uh, not probably uh, to be thought of as a table of genres. Like we have schematic differentiation of genres, like the epic, lyric, and the dramatic, for instance, in the classical Western tradition, which is actually based on criteria of distance between the speaker, what is spoken about, who is addressed, etc., etc. Now, here what I'm suggesting is that genres need to be probably understood in terms of the practices that they are embedded in. Like what is actually how do we describe the practice or the set of practices within which a text like Atmavilasam works? Yeah. which is quite different from the kind of practices in which we are located when we discuss the text in a classroom. Yeah. So these different practices refer to different orders of subjectivity, different kinds of aspirations, different ways of placing oneself in relationship to traditions, and different aims, different objectives. So here, I must say that here, literary studies could learn something profitably from some of the best works in anthropology. We need to develop tools for describing practices. And practices here need to be understood not merely as something which can be garnered through external ethnographic observation, but as something which needs to be thought through in a more philosophical, conceptual way, as involving questions of subjectivity, questions of selfhood, and questions of tradition. Yeah. And the last question by Maya Vinay, see, it's very interesting, like addressing, how do you address God in different traditions, and here, of course, my knowledge is limited, but the extreme elevation and extreme intimacy are both idioms which come up in different religious and spiritual experiential traditions. So ni, which is often understood as something which you use only in relationship to somebody of an equal or lower status, becomes available for addressing the divine. And I don't think Srinarayan is doing anything radically new there. Now, I think this is a longer tradition, and probably Srinarayan's compositions, some of the linguistic texts, here I'm speculating, I may be wrong, so I must warn you, may have also been inflected by the Tamil tradition, especially his close intimacy with the Siddha tradition, the Tamil writings which came from southern Tamil Nadu, etc. We can take another round
Yeah,
of questions.
yeah, there are two more.
Yeah.
One is from Rajnandini Shaw.
Right. Yeah.
She has
Right.
asked,
Yeah.
what are the extra literary ways of reading texts other than translation? And the second one is from Swati Dhada. She has asked, respected sir, is there a way to translate this you from Indian regional languages to English?
Could you repeat that question? I didn't fully understand
Respected
it.
sir, is there a way to translate this you from Indian
Translate
you?
the YOU?
Yes,
Okay.
from
Okay.
Indian regional languages to English.
Right.
These two we have got it wrong.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Rajnandini, thank you for that question. I see there are a number of ways of analysis. I haven't really systematically looked at them, which actually are extra literary ways of analyzing text. Like, for instance, uh, the computational kind of analysis which come up in our times, the recurrence of words, statistical analysis, and also there are extra literary analysis of literary production from a kind of from a kind of distant reading kind of point of view, where you do not really close read the text, but you look at large patterns of literary production. In such instances, the methods are, you could say, extra literary, in the sense that those methods arguably can be used for analyzing other objects as well. So this is an interesting question, because about literary history, I remember once Dipesh Chakravarti in a talk making a distinction between three senses in which one could use the word literary history. One is a history of literature, where the methodology really remains historical, and literature appears as an object. So just as you can have a history of a particular social movement or history of an object like the potato, you can also have a history of literature. Yeah, that is one sense. And the second sense of literary history is a kind of history which is available only through the study of literature, where you may actually also need to develop methods which cannot be separated completely from the object in question. Yeah, and then of course Dipesh Chakravarti spoke about a third idea of literary history, whereas you abandon the field of history altogether and you write literature as a mode of history writing. So there are many things of that kind, and translation, I would not know if one should call it extra literary in this sense. You know, the way in which it actually works with the text and seeks to understand or engage with them is what one would call at the very borders of the text, or at the contours of the text, touching the text at its limit, at its outer skin, rather than subjecting it to an interpretative extraction. You know? So this is what I was trying to get at while speaking about this question of variation. Now, the last question which came up about...
Professor Udaya Kumar, my mistake. The
Yeah,
last question is, I
yeah,
apologize for.
not at all. Yeah.
Is there a way to translate honorific addressing of you
Yeah, yeah,
from
yeah.
Indian regional languages to English? That
Yeah.
was the question.
Yeah, yeah. See, that's very interesting, you know, because in a way, I would say it is related to the question of addressing God as me, you know, and because me there becomes an honorific address, you know. The way in which the word me is used, it retains some texture and memory of the way in which the word is used in context of intimacy and even context of uh, talking down to somebody, but at the same time, it is also lifted up into a different kind of sense or terrain when it is used in mystical writing here. Now, I do not know if there is a methodological solution for this. You know, I do not think that any dictionary, any glossary can actually deal with this problem, because the way in which honorifics work in different languages, as all of us know, is very much related to the question of how verticality of human relationships is experienced within cultures. And of course, this verticality, vertical relationships have something to do with questions of power, but like sovereign power, for instance, is one of the models in which we try to imagine divinity as well as people who are powerful, people to whom we want to extend great respect, etc., etc. But the nature of sovereign power, its connotations, the cultural associations which attach themselves to it, all these things actually vary in different places. And even within the same language, they vary, which is what makes it possible for us to, or a writer in the 19th century, or even now a poet, to use a word like me in relationship to that which is placed vertically above you. So I don't think a lexical machinery is going to aid us there. You know?
Thank you. The next from Soumya Sajan from University of Hyderabad.
All right.
He has written, thank you, Professor Udaya Kumar, for this extensive session on Sri Narayan and translation. In the specific context of translation and identity of Sri Narayanan, can you please elaborate a bit more on the complexity in understanding the subject in his poetry and his context specific dialogues towards his popular identity in, in contemporaneity?
Could you read that last phrases once more, just last bit?
Okay, can you
And
please
the
elaborate a bit more on the complexity in understanding the subject in his poetry
mm,
and his context specific dialogues
mm.
towards his popular identity in
Ah,
contemporary.
right, right, yeah. Yeah, thank you, Soumya. Uh, see, uh, I have written a little bit about these things, which I'm sure you might be familiar with. uh, when it comes to poetry, uh, the way in which we work with his instructional texts and his uh, arguments about caste, or the anecdotal reports that we have about his conversations, the way in which we read them, they may not uh, always help us. There is something more which is needed there. Because often the uh, attempt has been to produce a kind of uh, uh, figure of Sri Narayana Guru as an author, as the author of certain pronunciations, certain interventions, certain statements which are also meant to, like in spiritual practice, certain statements which are actually meant to deflate or disrupt the field within which the question itself is posed. These are the ways in which we have often tried to. Now, here I'm not talking about the more simple and direct readings of Sri Narayana Guru in terms of doctrines and ideas, which people have often done. But when it comes to poetry, things become more complex. This is really because of the, at least I found it more complex because of the distance with between the literary culture of writing in verse uh, and what we call poetic at that time and what we call poetic now. And that is where I felt that there was a greater degree of uh, uh, depersonalization, if one may call it that way. That is, shedding of the personal in the articulation of the subject, even when the subject is presented in the first person singular as the I, and sometimes even as a locus of extremely intense experiences. In fact, that intensity can be staged in poetry of Sri Narayana Guru, precisely because of a certain framework of uh, impersonality or depersonalization, which the culture of verse and the culture of poetic writing of the times allowed him or permitted him or offered him. So this is uh, one of the points which I can make in response to your question. But otherwise, of course, it requires a much longer uh, response and much more thinking. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Udaya Kumar. The next one is from Ostri Ghosh. Uh, she is a you know translator from Norwegian language to English,
Okay,
and she is known for her Ibsen translation.
all right, yeah,
He has asked from Norway, isn't it usual to use the familiar you
right,
in many religious traditions for
yes,
God?
yes, yes, I agree with that. In fact, I wanted to mention that uh, in the context of Malayalam, you will find that happen with the Bible translations as well. The familiar, but in the case of Indian languages, the question of a social verticality. Here I'm also thinking about the question of caste, the question of norms of interaction between people who belong to different castes and different positions in the uh, uh, kinship framework, so to say. That makes the issue of the familiar and the respectful operate with slightly different connotations in the Indian context. This is also one of the things which happened when the Bible translations took place, because some people found it scandalizing that the familiar pronouns were used in many contexts in the language which was generated from the translations of the Bible or in missionary discourses. And this also leads to problems because people who converted to Christianity began using these familiar forms of address to people who were seen traditionally as their superiors. Yeah, and there are instances of backlash, for instance, against lower caste people who converted to Christianity, addressing their masters with familiar pronouns. Yeah, so there is a large context there, but you are absolutely right. Yeah, many religious traditions do have it.
Lakshmi Priya Gogoi from Assam asked
Okay.
you to comment on the translation of oral literature. How to go about it? What kind of strategies to adopt while translating oral literature?
Actually, Lakshmi Priya, I'm sorry, I'm not the right person to ask that question. As I said at the beginning, I'm not really a practicing translator, and I haven't really attempted translation of any oral work. But I would imagine that translation of oral texts would uh, inevitably push us into thinking about the question of practices much more clearly than when we are dealing with literate compositions, that is texts which were written to begin with. And in the latter case, we need to excavate the practice dimension sometimes, especially in an academic context, that needs to become a conscious attempt. Whereas in the case of the oral tradition, that focus on practices is probably inescapable.
This is the last one from Gunjan Kumari. Sir, how do
Gunjan,
you
yeah.
see the plight of abundant and enormous literature and culture of those languages which are not considered standard language with reference to translation?
Yes, Gunjan, thank you. This is really the problem which is at the back of some of the things I'm trying to think through. That in many cases, those languages, if we do not really see them, if we do not see these languages as discrete language identities, in which case we can see them as inadequate or in a state of powerlessness or things of that kind. But if we see the powerful languages and these languages themselves as part of a chain of variation, like once my friend Rita told me that when she travels in train, she finds that the language changes when you take a long journey in a train. But at no point is the case that language becomes unintelligible to people, at any given point, because it's a continuum. So if we take that kind of insight and look at a field of variation rather than of discrete identities, then probably we may have how should I say, a way of looking at it which would be more respectful to the life in these languages.
Now I would request Professor Parikkal to give vote of thanks.
Professor Udaya Kumar, I am really grateful to you for being with us despite your busy schedule, and you were busy with your fellowship and going abroad, preparations for that, etc. But despite that, you were with us and gave this lecture. Thank you for that fascinating lecture and a wonderful evening. In the description of your book on autobiography, you are
publisher has, somewhere written that you are more interested in the intricacies of history and also consider literature as, in a sense, history in person. Okay, you are indeed, following that, that aspect of and or that curiosity of yours, and your most of your works actually are very in-depth analysis of looking at Indian literatures, especially Malayalam literatures, and how they are inextricably actually linked to history as well as literary history and the linguistic communities and their political identities, etc. Thank you for that wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, Shivram. And I must again say sorry for forcing you to reschedule the lecture, change the date and time. Thank you very much. And thanks everybody for coming and listening to me. Thank you.
On behalf of Faculty of Arts, Communication and Indic Studies, Sri Sri University Cuttack, and Center for Applied Linguistics and Translation Studies, University of Hyderabad, I thank all our guests and registered participants for being with us today and listening to this marvelous lecture by Professor Uday. Uday, happy times in France.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll leave the meeting now.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Rendan.